good morning. Thanks very much to Sharon and Lance, and welcome to our community meeting in Europe for the first time in 3 years, yay! My name is Emma Sutcliffe. I work with the PCI DSS standards team and the team who have been working diligently on a standard called PCI DSS, which you may have heard we have a new version of, which is very exciting. Everyone at the council was really excited. This release of PCI DSS is the result of years of work. We started planning this back in 2017, I think, when the current version was version 3.2. And what was really important with this version was the amount of feedback that the community provided us that went into the final product of the standard. Now, there's a lot of new information in the standard. There is far too much for me to cover in one session this morning. So we have a lot of presentations on PCI DSS this week. I'm going to walk through some of the key highlights and changes that you will hopefully be aware of, but you might hear something that's new that you weren't aware of. And then after this presentation, we're going to have a quick fire round, which is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to cover the top 10 questions we've received about PCI DSS and provide you with those answers. And then we have 3 more sessions later in the agenda on tomorrow's program. So we will start with a look at how to plan and what to consider when you're considering your transition from 3.2.1 to version 4. We will then have a deep dive into what's new with the reporting in PCI DSS, including the report on compliance templates and the self-assessment questionnaires. And then we're going to have a panel of experts talk through the new customized approach and some of the things that you really need to be aware of if that's the approach that you're looking at. Now, as I said, PCI DSS version 4 is now released. It's out there. You can find it on our website in the document library. PCI DSS version 3.2.1 is also still there. When you go to the document library and you look to the PCI DSS section, there's a little drop down. We did get some feedback that folks were wondering if version 3.2.1 had gone away, but no, it's still there. You just choose which version of the standard you would like to download. Excuse me, you choose which version of the standard you would like to download, and then you can get all the supporting materials as well. There is also a lot of other supporting documents on our website to support version 4. The reporting templates are all published. Again, that's the ROC template, the attestation of compliance, and the self-assessment questionnaires. We also have the frequently asked questions for the ROC templates to help walk through some of those changes. There are also a prioritized approach for version 4 and a quick reference guide. Now, if you haven't seen the hard copy of the quick reference guide, we do have some over in the booth. They do go pretty quickly, so if you would like one, I would go and grab one at the next available opportunity. If you don't get one, I have one that I snuck away, so we can certainly negotiate terms if you would like to organize that one. The best resource probably to start with is the summary of changes. Now, this document contains a lot of information about what's new in the standard, and it also provides details about how the requirements themselves have changed on a requirement-by-requirement basis. So there's a good lot of information in there. And I'm very pleased to say as well, we also have translated versions of the standard into a number of languages already available on the website as well. There are particular microsites for, I think, the 6 different languages as well as English. So hopefully, that will also help us be able to have the standard more widely available across the global audience. Now, you may be familiar with these goals. We started with these goals when we started planning PCI DSS all those years ago, and these goals have been with us throughout the journey to this final product of the standard. And I'm very pleased to say that we have managed to incorporate all of these goals into what you see now in the final published version. If you haven't seen these goals, hopefully as we walk through this, you'll see how they fit into some of these changes. The priority being to make sure the standard continues to meet the security needs of the industry, of yourselves, to start promoting security more as a continuous process, to add flexibility and provide more options for organizations to meet security in different ways, and then also to look at how we can enhance the validation methods and reporting. Now, your feedback was key to this. I said that from the beginning. And it was the feedback that we received during our RFC processes that really helped us make sure that these goals could be incorporated into the final version of the standard. We had 3 different RFCs for PCI DSS version 4. There were 2 on the draft of the standard itself and 1 on the draft validation documents, so the reporting templates. And those 3 RFCs generated more than 6,000 pieces of feedback, which is an incredible amount of feedback. Most of our RFCs are between 200 to 500 pieces of feedback on average, so this is really a significant amount of information that we received from the community about what to put into this standard. And I can certainly assure you that every single piece of feedback was reviewed. Lauren Holloway and her team went through every single item. It was discussed with the working group, and every piece of feedback was identified to determine the best way of addressing it. So this really is the result of a collaborative effort with the broader PCI community. Now, looking at the standard itself, I mentioned there's a lot of changes, there's a lot's new. We're just going to touch on some of those key changes today. So let's see where we go. One of the most, I guess it's not related to the specifics of the standard, the requirements, but what we found very interesting during the feedback periods and our conversations with the community is how much people are looking to use PCI DSS to protect other types of payment information or other areas of their payment environment. So what we wanted to do was make sure that everyone was aware that you can apply the standard in this way. We have always promoted PCI DSS as a good, solid framework of security controls that can be used to protect all types of environments and protect any type of sensitive information. And we've actually incorporated that language into the standard with version 4 to make it clear that there are payment environments that are changing, and where those environments may not have traditional PAN or SAD, they may have other data elements that need protecting instead, that PCI DSS can still provide a solid security foundation to help protect those elements. We also do have an FAQ on our website that touches on this, about how you can use PCI DSS to support security for other types of environments. But it's actually built into the standard itself now, which I think is great. It really shows how the standard has matured and how it can be leveraged in more than just PAN and SAD. There is also a lot of new guidance in the standard, lots of topics. Before we even get to the requirements, there are pages of guidance in the front parts of the standard. We've added some new sections of guidance. We've also expanded the guidance for a lot of sections that were there. We've clarified some of the terminology. We've looked at explaining the difference between terms like account data, cardholder data, sensitive authentication data, and primary account number. Different requirements refer to different terms, be it cardholder data or SAD, for example. And these terms are all different. They all have specific meanings. So they don't use them interchangeably. So when a requirement refers to that one type, we wanted to make sure it was clear which data element that was actually referring to, that requirement applies to. We also updated some other definitions. We provided a lot of guidance on working with third-party service providers and some of the considerations when you have service providers involved in your PCI DSS implementations. We've provided some guidance on how to interpret requirements that have a time frame element to them. So if the requirement requests that something be performed daily or weekly or monthly or quarterly, what exactly that means with respect to the number of days or the calendar days or the working days and that kind of thing. So we've tried to provide some clarification around that. And there is a lot of new guidance on scoping as well. The section on scoping we had has been expanded. There's some additional diagrams and walkthroughs to sort of help plan your scoping approach. There's also a number of new appendices that were added to the standard. There was so much information, we didn't put it all up front. We put some of it at the back. And one of those is about how you can leverage the PCI software security framework, the SSF as we call it, how you can leverage products that have been validated to the secure software standard or using software vendors who have their validated processes under the secure software lifecycle standard, how you can use those products and services to help with meeting PCI DSS requirement 6. So there's a lot of detail about that in the appendix, specifically at the end of the standard. Now, flexibility was one of those goals I mentioned, which was a big driver for the changes in version 4. And in version 4, for the first time, we have introduced 2 ways to implement and to validate to the requirements. The defined approach is what we've always been doing. It's the approach that we've always been following, and it is still there in the standard. It's where the organization implements the requirement as it's stated, and then the assessor will come along and follow the testing procedures as they are defined in the standard in order to do the assessment. Now, we introduced the customized approach with version 4. Now, this approach is intended to provide more flexibility and an alternative method for organizations who are meeting security in different ways. So most of the requirements in the standard, but not all of them, most of them support a customized approach, and there is a customized approach objective defined for those requirements that do. Where a requirement doesn't support customized approach, there is no customized approach objective, so you can see that's quite clear. Now, organizations that are doing security in different ways, perhaps they're using new technologies, or they've implemented some innovative way to meet security in a way that's different than the standard has traditionally met it. This is where the customized approach can really help those organizations. So it allows those organizations who have good risk management practices, they've got solid processes for managing their security and maintaining it and monitoring it. They can do some of their own testing to make sure that the security control is working as intended, and they can then use that a customized approach as a way to meet the standard a little differently. Now, the requirements themselves, the structure of them in the standard has also been changed a little bit to incorporate all this new information, to incorporate the customized approach. This diagram is actually included in the standard. Don't try and read it. There's a lot of information up there. It's actually in the standard itself. But basically, it just shows how the requirement layout has changed a little bit. As well as the defined requirement and test procedure, there is now the customized approach objective. And we've also added a lot to the guidance column in version 4. So there was already a lot of guidance there, but we've really tried to organize it and make it more clear. We've actually structured the guidance so it's clear if it is intended to help with interpreting the purpose of a requirement. Some of the guidance provides examples of different ways a requirement could be met. There's some requirements also have guidance that may link to external references for more information about a particular technology or implementation method. And as well as the updated guidance column, there is also applicability notes for some requirements. Now, these applicability notes are located under the requirement itself, and they are very specific to how the requirement applies or potentially how the scope of that requirement and where it needs to be put in place. So those applicability notes are really key. They are part of the requirement from that perspective, and they apply both to whether you're doing defined or customized. They still apply to that requirement as a whole. It's the applicability notes section where you'll also find if there's any future implementation date defined for a requirement. That's where that will be. So that's a very key area to keep an eye on. Now, just going a quick touch through some of the noteworthy updates to the requirements. Not all the changes are about adding new requirements. A lot of the existing requirements have evolved with version 4 as well. One example is requirement 1. The concept of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, has been removed from the language in requirement 1, and it is instead focused on understanding how to protect the boundaries between a trusted and an untrusted network. An untrusted network being one that the organisation doesn't control the security of, or that hasn't been verified as meeting the applicable PCI DSS controls. Another example of a change is in requirement 12, we actually removed a requirement. The requirement for the annual organisational-wide risk assessment is no longer in the standard. This has actually been replaced with targeted risk analyses for different requirements, and we're going to touch on those in a bit more detail in a little bit. And requirement 8 is another area where there were some changes. Requirement 8 covers the authentication aspects. There's a lot of areas within authentication that's covered, and a lot of those requirements have evolved to ensure that they continue to meet the evolving security nature of how authentication is performed. Passwords is one of those topics when it comes to authentication. We still get a lot of questions about why the standard talks about password security. A lot of organizations are moving towards new ways of authenticating their users and their customers. But a lot of companies still do rely on passwords. Passwords do still exist very much throughout the ecosystem. So the standard still supports their use as a means of authentication, and it still has those requirements to ensure that where passwords are used, that they are strong and they are properly managed. Some of the changes for passwords include changing the minimum length from 7 to 12 characters. We did get some feedback saying it should be much bigger than that, but 7 was definitely not enough, so it's been changed to 12. That is one of those future implementation dated requirements, so until then the 7-character limit still applies, 7-character minimum still applies. But as of March 2025, that new character minimum will come in. We also added more flexibility to some of the requirements in the password area. One was the requirement not to use shared or generic accounts. That wasn't permitted in version 3.2.1. In version 4, they have been permitted, but with the understanding there are proper controls around them, and they're only used when they need to be, and they're properly managed and authorized and all of those sorts of good things. did mention there are some new requirements. There are a lot of new requirements. There are 53 new requirements in the standard that apply to all organizations. And again, this just reflects how much the security of the industry and how security is met is evolving. Now, some of these requirements are fairly straightforward. Some may involve a little bit more re-engineering of your processes, depending on what you already have in place. Now, these 53 new requirements apply to all organizations, and some of those, for example, may include sensitive authentication data. We have always had the requirement that sensitive authentication data cannot be stored after authorization, except by issuing companies. For those who are not an issuing company, who may be storing sensitive authentication data prior to authorization in order to support a future transaction, there are now requirements in the standard to make sure that that data is properly protected. It is protected with strong cryptography, and it is properly managed, and it has a retention and disposal policy. So that is specifically in there now to make sure that that SAD is protected wherever it exists. One of the other new requirements is that the internal vulnerability scans will now need to do authenticated scanning, and this is something that will help identify more vulnerabilities. And again, that is one of those requirements that has a future implementation date. Now, as well as these 53 requirements that apply to everybody, there are also 11 requirements on top of those that apply specifically to service providers. Still talking about sensitive authentication data, one of those new requirements for service providers is for those who are providing the issuing services, they do manage that sensitive authentication data, and they do again apply the strong cryptography where they're storing that to make sure that it is protected. There are also some new requirements for multi-tenant service providers and other service providers to support their customers' needs for information about their PCI DSS implementations, and for example, especially in a multi-tenant scenario, the pen testing requirements that their customers may have to meet PCI DSS, to make sure that those service providers are supporting those customer needs. Now, I've mentioned the future implementation date. Most of these new requirements do have that. But not all requirements have a future implementation date. There are 13 new requirements added to the standard that are effective immediately if you're going to do a version 4 implementation and assessment. Now, these new requirements are things like documentation level requirements, or that they formalize something that was already implicitly within the standard but wasn't actually explicitly called out. One example is the roles and responsibilities requirement to make sure that the proper roles and responsibilities for each security area are assigned. That has been added from requirements 2 through 11. There is also a requirement to document and confirm scope for PCI DSS at least once a year. And this was obviously always a part of having PCI DSS as part of your assessment process and your implementation, but now it's been formalized in a requirement, so there's a consistent way of documenting how that takes place. Now, if you'd like some more information about the different requirements, which ones are future dated, which ones are not future dated, the best place to look is that summary of changes document that I mentioned earlier. It has every single new requirement identified, and it also lists the effective date, whether that's immediately upon use of version 4 or whether it's that future implementation date, which is the end of March in 2025. If you haven't read the summary of changes, I really do suggest you do download it. There's a lot of good information in there, and it will really help you as you look through the standard to see how it's changed. Multi-factor authentication, still on the authentication topic, this is a requirement that already existed in the standard. There were 2 requirements, actually, one for any remote access into the CDE and one for any administrative access into the CDE. That is now evolving into, for the future implementation date, all access into the CDE will be required to use multi-factor authentication. And this is because multi-factor authentication is well recognized as a really critical way of protecting data. So we're really evolving that forward that way. This new requirement will eventually supersede the 2 requirements that are already there. Those 2 requirements are still in place until the new one becomes effective. But again, it's important as an example of how the security needs to evolve to protect that data. We did also introduce a lot of new guidance in the multi-factor authentication requirements in that guidance column to help provide clarity about where and when and how multi-factor authentication needs to be implemented, and also how to make sure the multi-factor authentication system itself is protected and that it's working properly and the integrity of that is maintained. There's 2 other areas where there have been new threats that have directly affected requirements that have been implemented in the standard. One of those is phishing. We've introduced a two-pronged approach, as Lauren would say, to protecting organizations and their people against phishing attacks. One is that there be a technical control in place that will detect and protect the individuals from the phishing attacks that come through, for example, on corporate email. The second requirement is to incorporate phishing awareness into the company's security awareness training. And that's so that their organizational staff can be on the lookout and identify a potential phishing or social awareness attack. The second big threat area that has resulted in new requirements in the standard is the web-based attacks that a lot of e-commerce merchants have been facing in the last quite a while. And this is particularly e-commerce skimming type of attacks, such as the mage cart type of attack. So again, there are two new requirements to protect against these. One is focused on managing the payment page scripts that are put in the payment page. The other is on having a change detection mechanism that can look out for unauthorized changes and can then obviously alert the organization so that they can be verified and hopefully detect any potential attack much sooner. Now, I touched on the fact we have this new targeted risk analysis. This replaces the annual corporate-wide risk assessment that used to be in requirement 12. There's actually two types of targeted risk analysis in the standard. One is specific to some requirements, and that's intended to provide flexibility. And this is where the organization can determine how frequently they perform a particular security control. And the types of requirements this applies to, for example, is the anti-malware requirement, where if the system isn't typically subject to malware, the requirement is that the organization do a periodic check to see if that is still the case. This is one of those where the organization can determine how frequently they need to do that based on their risk analysis. The second use of targeted risk analysis is for any organization that's using the customized approach. This is part of the process of doing customized approach. So if that requires some documentation as part of documenting your customized approach, there is a template in the back of the standard in one of the appendices for organizations that they can use to really identify which information needs to be included in that instance. Now, we also had some reporting that we're looking to evolve since it was published. The report on compliance templates, the SAQs, and the AOCs all had a new reporting option introduced, which is in place with remediation. And the intent of this option was to provide organizations with a means to work towards security as a continuous process by identifying where there may have been some gaps or some areas that needed improvement. And this was built into the reporting templates, to help support that purpose. Now, once these were published, we received a lot of feedback, asking about the impact it might have on that reporting. So we've been looking at how to address that. To do this, we had a lot of meetings with our board of advisors, which are the representative group for the participating organizations. We also had a lot of meetings with our GEAR, our global executive assessor roundtable, so that we could really get feedback from all aspects of the PCI community. And based on those discussions, it really came clear that the intent of in place with remediation was really something that we wanted to support. It was really seen as a valuable tool for communicating to the organization where they had those gaps, and also for the organization to be able to use that to prioritize and to have conversations with their senior management about where they needed to focus their security efforts. From the assessor perspective, they also felt that it really did help address a gap that had been in the reporting for some time by actually being able to identify these areas. The real questions came about whether putting them in the reporting documents themselves was the best place to have that information. So to help address those concerns, but still making sure we're trying to meet the goals that it was intended to provide and the benefits that it does bring, we are looking at taking that in place of the remediation option out of the reporting templates and putting it in a separate worksheet, and also refocusing a little. So it's less about remediation, it's less about tied to an in-place finding, and it's really more a useful piece of information that's between the assessor and the organization they're assessing, that organization can use to help improve their security going forward. So we're working on this at the moment. As I said, we're working on providing some different a different worksheet template that the assessor can use. This is intended to be an internal document as part of their assessment papers. And then the reporting templates, the ROC, the AOCs, etc., we're all updating those at the moment to take the in-place remediation option out of those so that you can have that separate function. The reporting documents, the official reporting documents will be separate from the guidance on working towards security as a continuous process. We hope to have the reporting documents out, in the next couple of months. They should definitely be out before the end of the year. And the worksheet and some other supporting guidance, FAQs and direction will all be out by early next year. Talking about dates, just a quick reminder where we are on the timeline. A couple of the key dates we've been talking about so far today are the effective date for some of the requirements that are currently best practices in the standard. This is March 2025, but before then, we have the retirement of PCI DSS 3.2.1, which is in March 2024. So these are the two most important dates that are coming up. There are a lot of resources on our website. I have mentioned some of them. Summary of changes, definitely in there a few times. We have a dedicated PCI DSS resource hub, which you can find on our blog, our PCI Perspectives blog. And that is updated every time we have a new document published or we have new information or anything we announce about PCI DSS version 4, you can find in there. So that's definitely a good resource to bookmark. We also have a lot of new media coming out about PCI DSS version 4. We have some podcasts, we have some video interviews with various stakeholders, including different members of the PCI team who worked on different aspects of the standard and the supporting documents. So there's a lot of good information you can find on our website. So if I were to conclude about what PCI DSS version 4 means, I think the one thing that keeps coming up is those 6,000 pieces of feedback. And that is really something that comes from the community. So from our perspective, this is a wonderful result, having that volume of input into the development of this standard. From our perspective, it was an incredible amount of work over the last few years to make sure that we work through all that feedback and continue to get further response. And even after the standard was published, as I just mentioned, we're looking at evolving the reporting templates based on that feedback as well. So your feedback is obviously very important to us. It makes a big difference to how the standard evolves. We don't want the conversation to end just because the standard is published. We're all here this week. I'm here this week. Lauren Holloway is here this week. She has unfortunately lost her voice today. Hopefully she'll be back tomorrow. But we have the whole PCI DSS team. We have the trainers here. We have the assessor quality team here. We have the programs team here. So come and see us at the booth. If you have any questions about the standard, keep giving us your feedback as you're working through it. We want to hear from you, how you're finding it, if there's any questions you have, which questions you're looking for us to find answers to so that we can help provide those to you. So thank you. I hope you found something interesting in this presentation. I am now happy to turn it back to Sharon, who's going to introduce the next session, which, as I said, is going to be a lot of fun. So don't leave your seats for that one. Thanks very much.